Skyler White has been drafted into one of modern television's most revealing roles. Not merely the spouse of a criminal, but the designated villain for the unforgivable offense of reacting to danger as though it were dangerous. The indictment is always delivered with the same bored confidence, controlling, nagging, hypocritical, obstructive, followed by an almost ceremonial refusal to discuss what she is reacting to. She is pregnant, financially strained, living with a teenager managing cerebral palsy, dealing with a sister whose kleptomania turns adulthood into an ongoing intervention, and watching a terminally ill husband behave like a man auditioning for a secret life he cannot plausibly explain. Somehow, the scandal is not the lies, the disappearances, the second phone, the mounting risk, or the criminal associations. The scandal is that she notices. The earliest hostility towards Skyler is rarely about ethics. It is about narrative alignment. On an initial viewing, the camera follows Walter White's transformation and invites complicity. His secrecy plays like intrigue, his lies like cleverness, his escalating violence like momentum. Skyler becomes the person asking tiresome questions, requesting basic transparency, insisting on safety, and expecting bills to be paid without a sideline in methamphetamine production. In other words, she behaves like someone raising children inside an actual household, rather than inside a power fantasy. Rewatching tends to expose how thin that hostility is. When the ending is known and the seduction of the underdog narrative wears off, the question changes from why does she not support him to why was anyone ever rooting for a man to destroy his family and everyone close to him? The hint was never subtle. It was printed in the title. This story is about moral decay, not entrepreneurial grit. With that framing restored, Skyler's behavior reads less like obstruction and more like the only sane response available in a home being turned into collateral. None of this requires pretending Skyler is flawless. She can be controlling, sharp, and compulsive about order. She occasionally speaks with an edge that invites irritation. She can be smug, particularly when she tries to assert competence in unfamiliar territory. Yet these traits are treated as monstrous only because they belong to a woman whose labor keeps the domestic world functioning. The controlling mother stereotype is routinely normalized, especially in households where parental authority is expressed through constant instruction and supervision, until it is attached to a woman who inconveniences a male protagonist's narrative. Then it becomes an unforgivable personality defect. Skyler is also judged by an impossible standard, condemned when she resists Walter's criminal trajectory, and condemned again when she adapts to it in an attempt to minimize harm. Refuse him and she is labeled disloyal. Cooperate to keep children safe and she is labeled complicit. The preferred spouse, apparently, is either silent or ornamental. The moment she becomes an agent, asking questions, setting boundaries, making plans, she is treated as an intrusion. It is difficult to miss the gendered subtext when a woman is punished for doing the basic work of survival. Walter's performance as the innocent good guy is the show's central con, and it works on the audience with alarming efficiency. Outside the home, he wears the mask of the mild chemistry teacher battling cancer. Inside, he reveals the unfiltered ego, narcissistic, self-justifying, and perpetually offended that anyone notices. He lies with an ease that would be impressive if it were not so corrosive, about money, time, relationships, danger, motives, and even the basic fact of his identity. He refuses legitimate help not because it is unavailable, but because accepting it would puncture the myth that he alone must conquer fate through sheer genius. Pride is treated as principle. Jealousy is treated as integrity. The family is invoked as justification, then ignored as soon as it becomes inconvenient to his self-image. Skyler, perversely, is forced to become competent at the very criminality she never consented to join. When the Enterprise arrives at her kitchen table, she does what Walter refuses to do. She thinks about consequences. She crafts cover stories, builds plausible narratives, and applies bookkeeping discipline to make illicit money look ordinary enough to avoid immediate collapse. Without her meticulously researched gambling explanation and her practical laundering plans, Walter's operation ends earlier and messier. The fantasy that she ruined him collapses under a single fact. She repeatedly stabilizes the chaos he introduces, not because she approves of it, but because she is trying to stop the fallout from reaching the children. The accusation that Skyler is a hazard to Walt is one of the more audacious inversions. Walter can poison a child, engineer killings, and shred relationships with clinical indifference, but the persistent myth is that his wife's questions are the real threat. This would be funny if it were not so revealing. Skyler is frequently the only person centered on the children. She is trying to prevent Walter Jr. and Holly from being hurt by the dangerous people Walter deals with. And she is trying to keep law enforcement scrutiny away from the household, especially given the proximity of Hank as a senior figure in drug enforcement. She is forced into a role where protecting the family includes protecting her husband from exposure, even as that husband manufactures the danger requiring protection. Skyler's most controversial choices also look different when stripped of selective outrage. The Ted Beneke affair is routinely treated as the smoking gun by critics who prefer tidy moral accounting. Yet the motive is made plain. It is less romance than strategy, a weaponized act meant to force separation, provoke divorce, and push Walter out of the house. The marriage has already been converted into a hostage situation by a man who will not leave, will not be honest, and will not stop endangering the household. Treating her attempt to regain agency as the central betrayal requires ignoring the context in which she is cornered. The series even supplies a moment that distills Walter's moral arrogance into a single line. After Ted's accident, Walter tells Skyler that he forgives her. He forgives her. He, the author of uncountable lies, the engineer of danger, the man who has already dragged the family through fear and humiliation, speaks as though he occupies the moral high ground. The line is not merely ironic, it is a case study in narcissistic framing. His crimes become invisible to him because they serve his identity, while her desperation becomes proof of her supposed depravity. The same distortion appears in the discourse about Skyler giving money to Ted. This act is framed as stupidity or betrayal, as though she gleefully sabotaged the family's finances. The more accurate reading is painfully straightforward. The payment is made to prevent an investigation that could expose the laundering operation and bring law enforcement crashing into the household. It is, again, triage, protecting the family from consequences already set in motion by Walter's decisions. The fact that this is later mocked as her destroying everything, while Walter is canonized as some saintly provider, is not analysis. It is fandom self-deception dressed as moral clarity. Some critics scramble for smaller grievances because the larger moral case does not hold. Skyler's early nagging is cited as evidence of cruelty, as though asking a spouse to stop behaving suspiciously while terminally ill is an act of tyranny. Her smoking while pregnant is raised as the one act that feels difficult to defend, and it deserves condemnation as irresponsible. But treating that as equivalent to manufacturing methamphetamine, orchestrating violence, and endangering children is not moral rigor. It is a preference for punishing women's visible flaws while excusing men's catastrophic ones. Even the Skyler is smug argument, often anchored in her meeting with Saul Goodman, shows how eager some are to punish tone rather than action. She presents herself as knowledgeable, an accountant who understands laundering concepts, only to be shown later checking details. The outrage is frequently theatrical, as though a moment of bravado under stress is a capital offense. A more plausible reading is that she is bluffing for leverage in a negotiation with a criminal lawyer, then verifying details because responsible adults do not gamble their children's futures on vibes. Then there is the infamous Happy Birthday Serenade, a scene that has achieved near universal consensus as one of television's most agonizing moments. It is regularly used to mock Skyler's supposed cringe factor, but it is more instructive as a portrait of coercive social dynamics. A boss requesting a sexy song from a pregnant employee whose husband is terminally ill, and an office full of adults encouraging it as entertainment, is not charming. It is workplace dysfunction under fluorescent lighting. The scene is horror precisely because it captures how easily social pressure can be disguised as tradition, and how quickly a woman's discomfort becomes office spectacle. Walter's competence remains real, and it deserves a precise label. Competence as a drug manufacturer and strategist, not competence as a husband, father, or moral agent. As a criminal mastermind, he is often impeccable, calculating, adaptive, ruthless. As a family man, he fails in every dimension that matters, dragging his wife and children into a disaster no amount of money can repair. The stain he leaves is not financial. It is psychological and relational. Fear, betrayal, grief, and the humiliation of being forced to live under the rules of a man who insists he is saving everyone while destroying them. A recurring defense of Walter rests on a seductive confusion. Admiring his competence is treated as admiring his character. The series makes his schemes clever, his escapes exhilarating, and his confidence intoxicating, which encourages viewers to mistake proximity for endorsement. Yet the distinction is basic. A criminal can be praised as a strategist while being recognized as a catastrophic spouse. Walter may be impeccable at manufacturing product and manipulating rivals, but he is an utter failure as a partner and parent, and no amount of tactical brilliance changes the fact that his family becomes collateral for his ego. This is why much of the Skyler backlash gravitates toward petty grievances about tone and domestic friction. Complaints that she tells him what to do or does not support him quietly assume that support is owed regardless of the behavior being supported. When that assumption is made explicit, it becomes grotesque. The preferred wife is expected to fuel an ego-driven descent into criminality with applause. If she objects, she is framed as the killjoy who blocks greatness. If she participates to keep children safe, she is framed as morally equal to the architect of the danger. The moral distortion becomes almost comedic when it migrates into sexual complaint. Skyler is mocked for an unromantic intimacy scene and dismissed as the provider of the world's worst handjob, as though awkward sex were an unforgivable breach of contract. The same observers can praise Walter's ruthlessness, ignore his cruelty, and wave away his violence as the price of ambition. The editorial implication is ugly but consistent. A woman's desirability is treated as more important than a man's humanity. Context also clarifies why so many people report a dramatic shift in perception across rewatches. Watching as a teenager or in early adulthood often maps neatly onto rooting for the protagonist's momentum and resenting any character who slows it down. Watching later, with more familiarity with relationships, finances, and fear, makes Skyler's choices read as painfully human. The experience resembles rereading a childhood novel as an adult. The same plot beats are present, but the emotional weight moves to different places, and what once read as annoying begins to read as alarming realism. That shift can extend to other figures as well. Hank's bluster looks less like heroism and more like armor, which makes his flashes of decency easier to notice. Marie's grating certainty and kleptomania remain difficult, and disliking her is not exactly a rare pastime. But even that irritation is minor next to the moral catastrophe Walter sets in motion. Jesse's arc becomes more punishing because it is harder to pretend exploitation is entertainment when the cost is fully visible. The series is, in that sense, expertly engineered to expose the viewer's complicity the second time around. The broader universe reinforces the same lesson. Better Call Saul, for example, does not absolve anyone. It simply illuminates the ecosystem of lawyers, hustlers, and rationalizations that make Walter's choices easier to execute and harder to escape. Against that ecosystem, Skyler's attempts to impose order are not petty. They are the last ordinary defenses available. Even the desire to continue into later stories, including the prospect of El Camino for those who have not seen it, tends to sharpen sympathy for the characters who pay the price of Walter's self-mythology, rather than glamorize the myth itself. Ultimately, the obsession with hating Skyler functions as a convenient distraction from the show's actual critique. Every time the conversation fixates on whether she is annoying, it avoids the uncomfortable fact that many viewers were tempted to celebrate a man's moral collapse because it was dramatic. Skyler is not the show's problem. She is the show's reality check. Her presence forces the story to keep returning to what the Empire costs, in kitchens and bedrooms, not only in deserts and warehouses. It also exposes the emptiness of the popular ranking game, in which everyone is declared equally awful, so no one has to admit who lit the match. Most principal characters are compromised in some way. Walter Jr. stands out precisely because he is not. That does not make Skyler perfect. It makes the hate misplaced, fundamentally. Some commentary tries to soften Walter's responsibility by reframing the debate as who is worse, as though moral analysis were a competition in which everyone must be declared equally terrible to avoid accountability. The show certainly contains a parade of compromised people. Callous opportunists, hypocrites, selfish actors, killers, cheaters, thieves, and pride addicts. Still, the impulse to flatten differences functions as a distraction. The important distinction is not that everyone is imperfect. It is that one person initiates the catastrophe and insists on deepening it, while others respond within constraints he creates. The rewatch effect also recalibrates perceptions of other characters. Hank Schrader, initially easy to reduce to swagger and arrogance, reveals a more layered humanity on closer viewing. Moments of genuine care, humor, and mentorship, including acts of decency toward Walter's son. Jesse Pinkman, already sympathetic, becomes harder to watch as the scale of his exploitation becomes clearer. His suffering lands differently when the trajectory is known. Marie, often broadly disliked, remains a source of irritation for many, and the show does not exactly beg for sympathy on her behalf. But even her flaws rarely inspire the same venom reserved for Skyler. If a single pivot point in Walter's downfall is demanded, the story offers several, all equally damning. Choosing to cook methamphetamine rather than accept ethical help or legitimate work is the original sin, a decision made not from necessity, but from pride. Pursuing expansion, entangling with Tuco Salamanca, escalating visibility, refusing opportunities to cash out, shows how quickly temporary becomes indispensable. Even his smaller blunders are instructive. Keeping the incriminating Leaves of Grass book accessible is the kind of amateur mistake that exposes how much of his legend depends on other people cleaning up after him. This dynamic becomes obvious in the slow evolution of Walter's willingness to disclose information. For long stretches, Skyler is forced to extract truth as though she were pulling teeth. Later, even small moments of openness feel notable, such as when he finally shares who Lydia is after she appears unexpectedly at the car wash. The fact that this registers as remarkable is itself an indictment. In a functional marriage, transparency is baseline. In Walter's world, transparency is granted only when it benefits him, and secrecy is defended as entitlement. The uglier chapter attached to Skyler is not written by Vince Gilligan. It is written by the audience. Reports of death threats aimed at Anna Gunn for portraying Skyler are not trivia. They are a diagnosis. Some people cannot separate actor from character and attack performers as though fictional spouses were real. Others can separate them, but still prefer a real person as a target, because it is easier to aim rage at a woman in public than to examine why a female character's resistance triggers so much hostility. The phenomenon is not unique, and comparisons to other actors who faced similar abuse only underline how routine this dysfunction has become. Underneath the noise sits the simplest explanation for much of the Skyler backlash: misogyny, sometimes overt, often unconscious, frequently dressed as character critique. A woman who fails to flatter a man's ego is labeled unbearable. A woman who sets boundaries is labeled controlling. A woman who is frightened is labeled weak. A woman who adapts to survive is labeled corrupt. The same audience that praises a male protagonist's ambition can treat a female spouse's fear as an annoyance. The standard is not moral, it is performative, and it punishes women for refusing to be props in men's stories. This is why Skyler remains, paradoxically, among the series' most realistic characters. Her reactions are not always admirable, but they are plausible. Suspicion when lies pile up, panic when the truth emerges, calculation when leaving becomes dangerous, and compromise when the family's safety is tied to decisions she did not make. She wants a normal life, a healthy husband, and children protected from violence. That desire would, if fulfilled, make for boring television. The audience's impatience with her is often nothing more than impatience with realism. Later expansions of the Breaking Bad universe can sharpen the tragedy rather than dilute it. Seeing the legal ecosystem of opportunists and enablers elsewhere in the narrative makes Skyler's position clearer. She is an ordinary person, caught in a machine designed to pull ordinary people into complicity. Her tragedy is not that she is sometimes unlikable. It is that likability is treated as her primary obligation, while Walter's crimes are treated as character development. Even her most frequently mocked scenes function as evidence of how thoroughly she is boxed in by expectation. Praise for Skyler does not require crowning her a saint. It requires basic proportionality. She is intelligent, often courageous in unglamorous ways, and relentlessly oriented toward protecting her children. She makes mistakes. She compromises. She sometimes speaks in a tone that invites criticism. Yet none of that approaches the scale of Walter's offenses, and treating her as the core problem is a refusal to distinguish between domestic friction and criminal devastation. Walter can be admired as a strategist while being condemned as a man, and insisting on that distinction is not moral squeamishness. It is the bare minimum of clarity. The final verdict, then, is blunt. Skyler White does not deserve hatred. She deserves to be read as a tragic figure navigating an impossible situation created by someone else's ego. She is an obstacle only to the fantasy that Walter's descent could be clean, controlled, and somehow heroic. She is a mirror held up to the audience, reflecting the uncomfortable truth that the real threat to the family was never the woman asking questions. It was the man who preferred his pride to their safety. Fully subscribe.